On the surface, it looked like the heartbreak of a daughter who had just lost her family. Tearful TikTok videos. Emotional tributes. A teenager clinging to social media as her world fell apart. Her words, "Save a seat for me in heaven," drew sympathy from strangers across the internet. But weeks later, investigators would allege something darker. That the very teenager grieving online was the one who pulled the trigger. The story of Sarah Grace Patrick isn't just another tragedy. It's a chilling paradox, a daughter mourning her parents in public, while prosecutors say she was secretly responsible for their deaths. This is not the story of a faceless crime. This is the story of a 17-year-old girl from Georgia whose life unraveled in real time under the gaze of a community, investigators, and millions online. Tonight, we examine every twist of this disturbing case, from the discovery of the crime scene, to the haunting social media posts, to the evidence prosecutors claim reveals the truth. Stay with us, because once you hear this story, you'll be asking the same question that still haunts Carroll County: what really happened on that February night? To understand the weight of this case, we first have to understand the teenager at its center. Sarah Grace Patrick was just 17 years old, a high school student in Carroll County, Georgia. On social media, she came across like so many teens her age: casual selfies, TikTok videos set to trending songs, and captions filled with emotions she didn't always say out loud. She lived with her mother, Kristen Brock, 41, and her stepfather, James Brock, 45. By all outward appearances, they were a normal, blended family in a quiet rural community. Neighbors described them as polite and ordinary, with nothing that suggested turmoil inside the walls of their home. Kristen was remembered as warm, protective, and deeply devoted to her daughters. James, her husband, was described as steady and hardworking. Together, they built a household that seemed unremarkable until February 2025, when tragedy struck. Friends say Sarah could be both introverted and expressive, someone who turned to the internet when emotions ran high. TikTok became her outlet. It was where she shared her feelings and, as we'd later see, where she publicly mourned the very people she's now accused of killing. In hindsight, those posts have become chilling artifacts, dissected frame by investigators and true crime followers alike. On the outside, this was just another American family. But beneath that picture, cracks were forming, cracks that would shatter completely on the morning of February 20th. February 20th, 2025. What began as an ordinary morning in Carroll County quickly turned into one of the darkest days the community had ever seen. Inside the Brock family's home, a horrifying discovery was made, not by police, not by neighbors, but by the youngest member of the household. Sarah's 6-year-old sister was the first to find the unimaginable. Her mother, Kristen, and stepfather, James, lay dead inside the house. Moments later, it was Sarah Grace herself who picked up the phone and dialed 911. When Carroll County deputies arrived, the scene raised immediate questions. Both victims had been shot, but there were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared stolen. At first glance, it didn't look like a break-in gone wrong. Instead, it looked like someone had walked straight into their lives and ended them. Initially, some wondered if this could have been a random home invasion. But investigators quickly noted details that didn't fit. The house wasn't ransacked. Valuables were untouched. And perhaps most unsettling of all, there were no indications of an intruder escaping into the night. From that morning forward, the question hanging over Carroll County wasn't just who could commit such violence, but whether the answer was far closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. In the days that followed, Sarah Grace Patrick transformed from a witness to the tragedy into its most visible mourner. On TikTok, the platform where she had already built a presence, her grief spilled out in real time for the world to see. She posted shaky, tearful videos. In one, her caption read, "Save a seat for me in heaven." In another, she wrote about finding her family wrongfully shot. For friends, classmates, and strangers alike, it was the kind of raw, vulnerable grief that demanded sympathy. Thousands offered condolences. Few could imagine what was to come. Then came the funeral at Catalyst Church. Standing before a grieving congregation, Sarah Grace eulogized her mother as a beautiful soul. She spoke of love, of loss, and of longing for peace. Her voice cracked as she ended with two simple words, "I'm sorry." To those sitting in the pews that day, her words were almost unbearable, the picture of a daughter shattered by tragedy. The community embraced her, shielding her with compassion. At the time, few questioned whether that sorrow might carry a different weight than it appeared. But in hindsight, unease began to creep in. Some remembered her language as strangely rehearsed. Others pointed back to her earlier posts, noting how much detail she shared about the crime before police had released any public information. What once seemed like heartfelt tributes began to look like something else entirely, a performance, maybe even a foreshadowing. At that point, no one could have imagined the storm that was brewing. A grieving daughter was about to become the prime suspect in her parents' murders. As Sarah Grace Patrick mourned publicly, her presence online became impossible to ignore. But beyond her tearful tributes, something unusual was happening. She wasn't just posting, she was reaching out. She began messaging popular true crime influencers, urging them to cover the story of her parents' murders. One creator, known online as Allegedly Reportedly, later revealed that Sarah had sent detailed messages describing the crime, messages that would eventually catch the attention of investigators. At first, it seemed like the desperate act of a grieving teen, wanting the world to know her family's tragedy. But police began to wonder, why would a victim's daughter be so quick and so eager to amplify the case online? In today's world, grief often unfolds publicly on social media. But investigators saw in Sarah's outreach something more, a digital footprint that didn't just share her loss but tied her directly to the crime itself. Every DM, every post, and every caption was cataloged. And soon, those messages, once seen as cries for help, began to look like pieces of evidence. When detectives followed the trail, they found inconsistencies between Sarah's public grieving and the private details she was disclosing. How could she know so much so soon? Why did her captions mirror facts only investigators should have known? And why was she seemingly orchestrating how the story of her parents' deaths should be told? What began as a wave of sympathy was shifting. Her own online activity, the very platform where she sought validation and comfort, was quietly building the case against her. By midsummer, the case against Sarah Grace Patrick was no longer built on suspicion alone. Carroll County authorities said they had mountains of physical and digital evidence linking the 17-year-old to the murders of her mother, Kristen, and her stepfather, James. Every post, every message, every late-night note she published online had become part of that mountain. One of the most striking pieces was a handwritten letter, later posted to social media. It began, "Dear Dad, I love you, we got this." Investigators say it wasn't just a note of affection. It read like a coded promise, a rallying cry between father and daughter. And sure enough, it was with her biological father that Sarah would eventually turn herself in. In July 2025, Sarah Grace Patrick walked into custody, accompanied by her biological father, bringing an end to a months-long manhunt that had both consumed and divided her community. Prosecutors moved quickly, charging her as an adult with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. But the most unsettling detail may be what investigators did not rule out. During a press briefing, the district attorney hinted that Sarah may not have acted alone. The possibility of accomplices, still unnamed, still at large, only deepened the mystery. What drove a teenager, barely old enough to graduate high school, to face charges of executing her own family? And if she wasn't alone, who else shared in that darkness? When a case this shocking lands in the headlines, people instinctively want a simple answer: why? But experts warn that why is usually the hardest question to answer, especially when the suspect is a teenager. That's because juvenile homicides are relatively uncommon, and the circumstances that produce them are complex and often rooted in family dynamics, developmental issues, and environmental risk factors. Longitudinal studies of juvenile offenders show a pattern. Where youth do commit homicide, investigators commonly find a mix of prior family disruption, exposure to violence, mental health problems, and other risk elements, none of which provide easy explanations, but all of which give investigators lines of inquiry to follow. In the public coverage of this case, forensic psychologists and juvenile crime experts told reporters they were concerned about signs that should trigger formal clinical evaluation. Court TV's reporting captured experts urging that any teen facing such serious charges receive comprehensive, court-supervised mental health and developmental assessments, both to determine competency to stand trial and to understand the defendant's mental state at the time of the alleged acts. Those evaluations help separate genuine psychiatric illness from dramatic behavior that, while alarming on camera, might stem from developmental volatility or acute stress. Social media complicates that picture. Psychologists and media scholars point out that platforms like TikTok encourage performative expression, curated moments of grief, anger, or confession intended for an audience. That performance can be sincere, manipulative, or some combination of both. Online behavior alone is rarely dispositive. Still, the digital record matters to investigators because it leaves recoverable traces, timestamps, private messages, deleted posts, and metadata that can corroborate or contradict other evidence. In this case, prosecutors have said the investigation relied heavily on both physical traces and an extensive digital trail, a claim publicly reported by multiple outlets. Forensic linguistics, the study of language use in legal contexts, is one of the tools investigators sometimes call on when online speech is central to a case. Linguists look for patterns, unusually precise timing details, distancing language, or inconsistencies between how a person writes about events publicly versus privately. Those patterns can be suggestive, but experts caution they are not proof. Language analysis contributes context and probability, not a definitive verdict. Academic reviews of digital text forensics underscore this point. Linguistic markers can point investigators to leads but must be corroborated with hard forensic evidence. Several commentators and clinicians who reviewed publicly available material in this case told reporters they saw behaviors that merited clinical attention, attention-seeking posts, intense emotional swings, and public displays of grief that later collided with investigators' findings. But they also warned against armchair diagnosis. Clinical judgment requires interviews, records, and testing. A viral clip is only a starting point for professionals, not a substitute for them. That caution is consistent with what juvenile justice scholars have long argued. Development, environment, and clinical history matter far more than a single performance. Finally, it's worth underscoring what we still do not know. Prosecutors say they collected extensive physical and digital evidence and have moved to charge the teen, but they have not publicly articulated a motive. That absence is one reason experts insist on careful, evidence-based analysis. Until motive and state of mind are established through forensics, witness testimony, and clinical evaluation, the why remains an open question, and it's the courtroom, not the comments section, that will be best equipped to answer it. In Carroll County, where Kristen and James Brock were remembered as caring parents and devoted church members, the news of Sarah's arrest landed like a lightning strike. How could the daughter who had wept for them in public, who had stood before their congregation apologizing for their loss, now be accused of ending their lives? Among those closest to the family, reactions were deeply divided. Some classmates and neighbors remembered Sarah as a bright, sometimes troubled teen, but a girl they couldn't imagine capable of violence. Others whispered that something about her grief had always felt uneasy. Her trembling speech at the funeral, her captions online. For some, it had seemed authentic. For others, it had felt too practiced, too heavy with detail, as though she were speaking not just to mourners, but to an invisible audience beyond. Her grandfather publicly defended her, urging the community not to rush to judgment. In his eyes, she was still the granddaughter he knew, not the hardened suspect the headlines described. His defense echoed a larger struggle in Carroll County, reconciling the image of a teenager who had always been part of their pews and classrooms with the accusations now stacked against her. Online, the community mirrored that divide. Some offered prayers, insisting she was innocent until proven guilty. Others saw her TikTok eulogies and church apology as chilling foreshadowing evidence, in their view, of guilt hiding in plain sight. Comment threads filled with arguments. Was she a grieving daughter or a calculating killer? Her classmates, too, wrestled with disbelief. Teachers spoke of a girl who had her struggles but also her moments of brightness. Friends described her as eager for attention, sometimes dramatic, but still a teenager navigating the turbulence of adolescence. To some, the accusations felt impossible. To others, they felt like the tragic conclusion to a story they had always feared might end in crisis. And beyond the schoolyards and sanctuaries, the broader community was left stunned. A family that had once appeared picture-perfect was now torn apart. A daughter accused. A 6-year-old was left to grow up with the memory of what she discovered that February morning. And neighbors asking themselves, what signs did we miss? What truths were hiding in plain sight? As the shock settled into silence, the case moved where all tragedies of this kind must eventually go, into the courts. 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, now charged as an adult, faces 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault. For the community, the questions remain emotional. For the legal system, they must become procedural. Sarah remains in custody without bond. Prosecutors argued that the severity of the charges, the weight of evidence, and the risk of potential accomplices make her release untenable. A bond hearing is scheduled, but even her own defense team acknowledges that freedom before trial is unlikely. Her defense may raise questions of competency or mental health. Court-appointed experts are expected to evaluate her ability to stand trial, as well as her mental state at the time of the killings. These evaluations will shape not only how the case proceeds but also how a jury, someday, may interpret her actions. If mental health defenses are raised, the trial could become a battleground between psychology and prosecution. Meanwhile, prosecutors have hinted at something darker. The district attorney signaled that investigators have not ruled out additional arrests. If Sarah did not act alone, who else may have been involved? The answers are sealed within the case files, waiting for a courtroom to unseal them. For now, the why remains unanswered. And the full truth, whether of motive, of accomplices, or of a teenager's state of mind, may only emerge in a courtroom. A daughter's grief, captured on TikTok. A family torn apart by bullets. And a community left reeling, still asking what really happened on that February night in Carroll County. Was this the act of a troubled teenager spiraling beyond control? Or is there more to this story than what has been revealed, threads of influence, accomplices, or hidden motives still in the shadows? For now, those answers remain locked in evidence boxes and sealed affidavits, waiting to be tested under oath. But what do you think? Do you believe Sarah Grace Patrick acted alone? Or is this case far more layered than it appears? Join the conversation in the comments. Your thoughts and theories matter, and we'll be following every update as this case unfolds. Make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and follow this channel for more in-depth investigative true crime stories. Stories where fact and mystery collide, and where the search for truth never stops.